Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM review. In the past, I've made no attempts to disguise my feelings regarding this particular film. This movie has its flaws and shortcomings like any movie does, but I've never been as excited to talk about a film since I reviewed Wendy Wu some time ago. Part of that is due to this movie being one of the most underrated DCOMs ever made, and I think my reviews for movies I consider underrated are relatively higher in quality. Hopefully, that trend continues, but in any case, since there's not really that much to spoil, let's jump right in and take a closer look at Dadnapped. We kick things off with an introduction to our lead character. I like what they do with the opening shots here because it's clear, without directly telling us, that this family is in some form of disarray based on Emily Osment's reaction to her family picture. And, not surprisingly, the way things are shot here is very important because, well, you already know by now, but we'll get there. So, Hannah Montana's own Emily Osment plays a girl named Neal Morse here, and one thing is made clear right away. She's not exactly the most mentally stable person in the world, as she constantly has visions of Trip Zoom speaking to her. It's made clear that even before this movie technically starts, that she is very much over Trip Zoom and everyone's fascination with it, making this book report on Trip Zoom's latest adventure all the more arduous. It's a silly scene, but remember it when we break down the movie later on. And we also learn that her dad, Neal Morse, is the author behind the critically acclaimed Trip Zoom books. But, more importantly, it's made very clear that her dad isn't the most attentive or reliable person in the world when it comes to his family. And now, Melissa's perspective makes complete sense, because Trip Zoom is taking away all the time she should have to spend with her father, which likely was the cause of the divorce he and Melissa's mother went through. But then, why is Trip Zoom, who she can't stand, invading her headspace for almost the entire film? We'll talk about that later as well. So Melissa and her dad have hit the open road to go camping. But looks like dad is being dad again and is trying to tweak their plans. So they stop by at the Mercury Zoom convention, where all manner of crazy fans are awestruck by seeing the real Neal Morse. I've actually worked conventions before, and trust me, for as weird as these people seem, this depiction is actually underplaying just how far fans will go. In any case, while we're there, we get introduced to all the supporting characters. David Henry as Wheeze, Moises Arias as Andre, Jason Earls as Merv, Phil Lewis as Maurice or Mo. The most surprising thing about this cast, though, is Denzel Whitaker as Sheldon, because he was really good in The Great Debaters, but here he's just a throwaway character. So, Neal has to judge a contest about which of the fans are the ultimate Zoomers or something like that, but then a terrible smell clears the room. Directly after, the trio of Wheeze, Andre, and Sheldon kidnap Melissa's dad. Didn't see that one coming. But, for as over-the-top as this movie can be, it never actually resigns itself to saying its title out loud. So, since this is a movie, the police can't really do anything to help, so it's up to Melissa to save the day, something she's at first reluctant to do until Trip convinces her otherwise. After the chase leads them to a library, Neal is shown having a bit of fun with his captors, since they aren't really the bad guys, but we saw that coming too. But what's more important here is the fact that he just doesn't understand his daughter. He's barely able to separate himself from his work for 2 seconds in order to do something that means a lot to her. Not only can you see why he's an ex-husband, but it's more clear now than ever that he's got his own set of psychological hang-ups. So, in the aftermath of that, Mo and Skunk, no really his name is Skunk, apprehend Neal, and wouldn't you know it, he gets dadnapped again. And now, it's up to the original dadnappers to save the dad that got napped again from the new dadnappers. Calling this a scattershot plot progression would be an apt description to this point. So it turns out that these captors don't want money or fame, Mo just wants to help Skunk become a better writer. An interesting deviation from the way these things usually play out, and if nothing else, it makes these characters a little more interesting than most DCOM villains. One of the things this movie does really well on the back half is its appreciation for cinema and storytelling, not just with Mo and Skunk's love for the classics, but also with the way Neal and Melissa talk about improving Skunk's writing. They are general tips, yes, but the way the pair act out those moments feels very genuine. But before that, we get a really great scene with Melissa confronting her father about his habitual absence in her life. It's some pretty good acting on the part of both actors present. There's so much emotional baggage that both of these two are dragging through the movie that this pivotal moment helps ease some of that weight. But this next part is a bit more dubious. So Melissa needs to use the bathroom after Mo stops for gas. Then, she conjures up a plan that will allow Wheeze and the guys to follow their trail. And it would be a smart plan, except for the fact that if Mo hadn't agreed to go back to the hotel versus literally any other place, her plan would have failed, and neither her nor Neal knew that this pair was working for Merv at that point in time. If they did know that, then going back to the hotel would be the obvious choice, but I think they got a little lucky here. I also don't think Melissa ever suspected Merv before then, because nothing about their previous interaction suggests that. Then, we get more of those writing scenes. It's kind of funny how some of the best writing in this movie stems from characters talking about what makes good writing, and honestly, I think if the movie had delved even deeper into that area and used it as a more direct metaphor for a strained father-daughter relationship, we get an even better film. But even still, I do like how their shared interest in storytelling does end up mending those fences to a large degree. That makes the most sense since a written character is the biggest thing keeping Melissa and Neal from truly connecting in the first place. Getting back to the plot, Merv reveals his secret plan to have Neal Morse write a book for him, which leaves Mo and Skunk a little bit screwed. But Melissa uses quick ingenuity and a rabid fandom to her advantage to point everyone else in the right direction. So, they assemble in a final fight akin to a live-action version of the best parts from the Recess movie, except messier. And finally, the cops do show up and arrest the villain after he's been defeated, as they tend to do in movies. The plot of this movie isn't overly long or complicated, and outside of a few novel concepts, you pretty much see everything coming from 15 miles away. This film will never be confused with Avalon High in that regard, but in that movie, the mystery elements were more of the focus. Here, the focus is on Melissa, and I mean all of the focus, including the resolution, where she realizes Trip Zoom is based on her, leading to him fading away during the awards ceremony after appearing for what I assume to be the last time in her life. But before we talk about that specifically, let's talk about the other characters. Phil Lewis is great in pretty much everything, and this movie is no exception. He really takes over the screen during some of his best moments, but then again, this is Mr. Mosby we're talking about, so it's not exactly surprising. Skunk is one of those on-the-nose, stupid-on-purpose characters that are usually annoying, but I think here, he was a little less so than most. Both of these characters were pretty fun as a unit, and I think the decision to give them depth beyond let's just kidnap this guy works very well to place the emphasis of the story more on storytelling, which, as I mentioned, helps rebuild the bonds of a damaged relationship. The trio of Wheeze, Andre, and Sheldon aren't what I'd call exceptional supporting characters. Sheldon has all the on-screen presence of a paper bag, and every line he's given is groan-inducing. As far as Moises and David go, you pretty much get what you expect from them. Andre is pretty much playing Rico, while David goes for an awkward geek thing, which he doesn't quite sell the whole time. But I do like that they incorporated that almost instinctive, figure-things-out-as-we-go mentality that made Justin Russo an all-time great character here as well. This movie is a little all over the place in terms of pace and progression, so David portraying a character that can work through that functions well. Alright, now here's where it all comes together. First, with Neal Morse, the critically acclaimed author of Trip Zoom. He's pretty much been a bad father for most of Melissa's life in order to focus on his work, and I like how they conveyed all of that through the actors present without ever feeling the need for a flashback to a missed dance recital. We've seen the empty chair a million times, we never ever need to see it again. Just through the acting job George Newbern does here, we learn so much about Neal as a character and as a dad. We never once need to question why Neal would go through a divorce, because this film did a great job at conveying why his marriage would go sour without ever needing to involve his ex-wife beyond one early scene. He's so wrapped up in the world he created that he's almost as obsessed with it as his fans are before toning that down a bit for Melissa's sake. And he even knows how to actually construct the doodads that Trip Zoom uses in his books. He might not ever win Father of the Year, but he's very dedicated to his craft. I'm placing a lot of emphasis on this aspect because it's such a smart way to construct a character. Just like with most Paul Hohen movie parents, there's a lot you can analyze and interpret because the film is never overly obvious in that area, which is a huge plus. The way he plays off Emily Osment is really good too, especially during their heavier scenes. And he walked a fine line in portraying a father that genuinely thinks he's trying but always ends up putting work first. I don't think that should be dismissed out of hand, because if he went too far in any other direction, he would have either seemed like an unfeeling prick or conversely made Melissa seem unreasonable, but neither of those things happened here. All in all, a very smartly conceived character played by an actor that works through the script and the screenplay very well, even through some of the truly insane moments. Emily Osment brings an attitude and gravity to Melissa that works really well in this film. We'll talk plenty about why her character functions so well into the movie soon, but just as far as acting goes, she's pretty good here. There's a good amount of nuance to her character that is on par with, but also a little bit better than, the great work Peyton listed in The Swap. There's really not much to say beyond that without breaking down the movie as a whole, so let's jump right into the analysis. Emily Osment, more so than any lead in any DCOM ever, is the focus of this movie, and the reason why is because the movie is constructed in such a way that almost everything that's seen is seen through the eyes of Melissa herself. We don't just see the movie from her point of view. Most films can claim that. No, we see the entire world through her point of view. Remember how I mentioned the importance of how things are shot? Enter the Dutch angle, the proper term for filming scenes with a noticeable tilt. This is crucial to the Trip Zoom scenes because the angle of the shot represents the psychological uneasiness that Melissa experiences when Trip takes physical form. We're not just watching Dadnapped when we watch this movie. We're literally seeing what Melissa thinks she sees, even if some of the things she does see aren't realistic or all that fathomable, but that's the whole point here. This was established very early on in one of the most important scenes, a scene that will slip right past you unless you think about what it means. The classroom scene. Why is this scene so important? Let's break it down. This one kid does a book report on an unreleased Trip Zoom book. We know that it hasn't come out yet since the teacher says as much. Melissa is obviously not too enthralled by the concept, and afterwards, the entire class does the famous floss chant together. Nothing about this scene makes sense, except all of it does. Because again, this is Melissa's perspective we're seeing. Now, let's go one step further. Remember when Twilight came out, and that was the only thing certain subsections of people wanted to discuss? It seemed like every girl, and some guys too I imagine, from your 4th period class was talking about vampires and werewolves incessantly. So of course, it would be annoying to many people not in that subsection, even if the reality was only 4 or maybe 5 people total were actually that vocal about it. And even if we talk about something with decidedly more quality, like The Dark Knight back when it came out, not everyone likes Batman or superhero movies, so for as much as you could talk about it, it might annoy others. I bring up those examples to make this point. It's impossible for everyone in the class to be so inexplicably coordinated for a property that would likely have no shortage of naysayers regardless of overall merit. It's completely ridiculous. Except it isn't, because we're seeing Melissa's perspective, meaning that she interprets her entire class as diehard Zoomers because that's what it feels like to her. And because she also has visions of the man himself, it makes sense that her perspective would manifest itself in advanced ways as such. In reality, which Melissa is very much separated from, there's probably only a handful of Zoomers among them, with the rest of the class either just knowing of the books or not caring. But just like the Rogue One quote, the Zoomers that were there made 10 men feel like 100, so to speak. And the end result is what we see because that's what Melissa perceives. And it goes deeper than even that, because Melissa is kind of blunt, but not so direct most of the time that she could be compared to Sharpay in terms of sociopathy, but it is partially there. She doesn't live completely in her own world, so plot points like going to a convention, getting taken, and then eventually saving the day probably happen more or less in the way they were framed. Otherwise, we have something more akin to A Beautiful Mind, and I don't think that's what they were going for here. But the convention itself is pretty bonkers, and it's from this setting that most of the movie's most absurd visuals come from, in addition to some absurd characters. But given what we now know of Melissa's current mental state, the setting doesn't seem nearly as ridiculous, because given how sick of Trip Zoom she is, of course she's going to view superfans as particularly nutty, even though some of the stuff depicted here isn't even the craziest stuff I've seen, and trust me, I've seen quite a bit at these kind of events. But what really sells it more than any other character is Merv. We can pretty much tell he's up to no good from the jump, but look at how he's portrayed early on. Just another character really, but then, as soon as it's revealed that he's the mastermind behind the dadnapping, he all of a sudden becomes this flower-sniffing, over-the-top, overly campy Saturday morning cartoon villain. That's partly because once Melissa's perspective changes, the movie changes with it. But taking one step further, it's also because of her connection to Trip himself. He's part of her, so now his perspective as a superhero who takes out silly bad guys for a living gets mixed in with Merv, and there you go. Melissa is never defined by a singular point of view until the movie ends, but before then, it's two individuals sharing the same headspace. That's all well and good, but then the movie's resolution ties it all together in pretty much the best way it could. The wacky, zany movie we get on the surface is in part wacky and zany because Melissa perceives everything Trip Zoom related to be overplayed, but that perspective has less to do with annoying fans and more to do with fighting against Trip for the attention of her father. This, of course, represents a purely internal struggle, with Melissa fighting and learning from herself in an effort to be worthy of her father's time, even though he's in the wrong. Why? Because she's projecting her feelings about the situation onto Trip until she finally confronts Neal about his constant absence in her life. But before that, all the anger, turmoil, and frustration regarding their relationship was packaged with his creation and not directed at Neal himself, because it's easier to blame Trip than to blame someone you actually love. But she also learns from Trip, not just to beat him, but because the two are more alike and connected than Melissa first realizes. And just like frenemies elsewhere, when really bad things happen, like Dad being kidnapped, they put their feud on hold and help each other to save him, because his safety is far more important than any one of them winning his favor. This is how to properly portray frenemies. Ironic considering this movie is garbage. Trip and Melissa's dynamic relationship eventually has Melissa realizing that asking Trip for advice is the same thing as asking herself. And since getting kidnapped helped her and her father connect in some major ways through their shared passion of writing, she no longer has any reason to hold any contempt for Trip. She's gone from blaming Trip for her father's shortcomings to accepting him as an extension of herself. And what happens when she accepts him? No more Dutch angle. And because of that psychological breakthrough of sorts, she's finally able to let go of him completely in the closing scenes and connect to her father in a more meaningful way, now that they've unloaded a lot of the emotional baggage we discussed before. The scene that shows Melissa looking back at Trip's cutout before joining her father on stage was a great shot on that end, because not seeing Trip next to her brings us back into a plane of reality where things are going well, but for real. And now, the Morse family can finally attempt a full repair of their until recently heavily damaged relationship. That focus on family ties and the mental framework that comes from it makes for one of the better resolutions in any DCOM, because it works on every plane the film operates from, in addition to making perfect sense given what we know and what we learned. And that's Dadnapped. So, what's the verdict? Dadnapped is one of Paul Hogan's better movies. I know I use his movies as a scale quite a lot, so I'll briefly explain what I mean by that. His best film is True Confessions. We pretty much all know that. And then, one tier down would be Jump In, Let It Shine, and You Wish. The next three movies are the films I'd say are his other best, but not enough to be mentioned among the all-time greatest DCOMs. In no particular order, How to Build a Better Boy, Camp Rock 2, and of course, this movie. And everything else is either at or below Read It and Weep, so I consider those films his lesser works. All of his movies are still miles above most DCOMs, and as I often say, he simply has never made a bad film. And the reason Dadnapped is one of his better movies is because it captures a unique, almost cosmic level of intelligent movie making that seamlessly combines aspects of perspective, broken families, mental coping mechanisms, as well as understanding how to balance out those elements with the zany stuff a lot of his films convey in the foreground. But this time around, the wackier elements are a lot more preordained, not just because we expect that from DCOMs to a certain extent, but because it's more par for the course when dealing specifically with Melissa, Trip, and their unique point of view. The camera work, the plot progression, Melissa and Neal as characters, it all points to that being the case, in addition to a few key self-aware pieces of dialogue over the course of the entire film. And the reason that clever construct makes sense is because we know who Paul is as a filmmaker, someone who's an absolute master at covering up his true intentions and using carefully placed details to make a much deeper film than anyone else in this very specific field. And one of the main reasons his films are so criminally underrated is because very few people are willing to understand his work beyond just a cursory glance. And Dadnapped might just be the most on-the-nose movie in terms of being a better movie than it at first appears to be. The focus on writing and improving it and allowing that to connect the leads can be taken as a metaphor for what actually goes into writing a coherent DCOM. It still functions on the surface like a prototypical zany DCOM, except the intention here is more pronounced because of how Melissa's perspective makes the film what it is. This is a film made by a filmmaker who knows exactly what the stereotypes and cliches of this movie genre are, and instead of subverting them into a parody the way Teen Beach did, he made a much better film by incorporating psychology to make the movie perhaps even more absurd. But Dadnapped also managed to balance out those quirky elements by giving us some truly resonating moments and effective character arcs, the likes of which define some of the all-time great DCOMs, some of which Paul himself obviously directed. And what's even smart about that detail is how those more poignant moments come in conjunction with Melissa connecting more to reality and not her blaming Trip fantasy, thus allowing her, and by extension us, to see what's really going on in one of the most deeply layered DCOMs ever made. But even still, there's some stuff here that just doesn't work or could have been much better. The first half of the movie was way too all over the place, despite some of those scenes having their own importance to the larger narrative. I also feel like they used Trip Zoom too overtly. What I mean by that is I feel like a lot could have been gained from having him as just part of the background, not saying anything sometimes, to further emphasize Melissa's psychological state. Having her, as well as us the audience, see Trip Zoom in a larger variety of ways would have made for a more captivating look into her psyche. But this also isn't designed to be a psychological thriller, so maybe that would have proven to be too tonally divergent. Also, the side characters not played by Phil Lewis aren't exactly special. Jason Earls wasn't overly impressive, Denzel Whitaker just might be the worst part about this movie, and there's not even a lot I can say about David Henry here. You could also argue that even though there's a reason for a lot of the campier moments, that said moments are just too campy. I would, however, make the opposite argument. I feel like certain elements are kind of downplayed compared to how real-life superfans would operate. People in our world get beat up for spoiling Star Wars, to say nothing of the fan base on the other side of the fan universe that might just be even more passionate. So I think that if the movie took things from ridiculous to pure unadulterated madness, it would work a lot better. And there are a few plot holes present that aren't film breaking, but feel overly coincidental at best, and with a few minor changes, those holes are easily filled. These shortcomings are the biggest reasons why I don't consider Dadnapped a great film, but instead a really good one that could have been even better. All in all, I think Dadnapped is the furthest thing from a Paul Hogan gateway film. It's one of those movies where appreciating what it does beneath the surface may only come after you've familiarized yourself with his vision as a director, and even then, you still might not like the movie, but you can at least understand the perspective of those who do. I think there is a difference between the best DCOMs and what I'd consider the smartest DCOMs. There's at least 25 films I'd say beat out this one, but in terms of the elements it utilizes here, I would call it top 10 in intelligence. The way it uses camera angles to emphasize characterization, the way it uses strained relationships to get solid performances out of the two leads, and the way it figures out how to be self-aware enough without being self-aggrandizing or self-deprecating, the very definition of a metaphorical tightrope walk, are all positive traits. But I do think that both the clear and less obvious flaws hold this movie back from being an almost airtight, geek charming level narrative that I would say is both smarter and overall better for a variety of reasons. But I don't really have time to dive into those reasons because this review is already pretty long. In closing, Dadnapped will likely never be a movie that appeals to everyone. It's very particular in that way, and even if all of you end up thinking about it more, many of you might come up with a completely different conclusion than I did regarding why things happen the way they do here. And that's awesome, because without different perspectives, movies would just be movies. My recommendation is a clear one, but as I often say, the only way to know for sure is to give it a watch and decide for yourself. But now, I've got an interesting challenge for all of you, if you're brave enough to accept. You already know what I think is the most underrated DCOM ever, but I want to know what you think is the most underrated DCOM ever. Make your argument down below, and the best response gets to choose the next DCOM or film review. It can be anything from the Kim Possible movies to even Mulan. But please, know that some choices would make me cry myself to sleep. But until then, thanks for watching.
I may be the who your dad writes about, but you're the why. Remember that.